Winston Churchill, a giant of history, famous for his inspiring leadership.
Advance, Britannia! Long live the cause of freedom!
But behind the legend lies a complicated character.
People tend to see Churchill, the icon, Churchill, the bulldog warrior, and of course, that's not the whole story.
He was an aristocrat and a man of the people.
It says a lot for his charisma and his humility that he was accepted and liked.
A trailblazer who also had questionable beliefs.
He is an old-school imperialist. He calls Indian people the dusky nation.
This is the story of the man behind the myth, using rarely seen footage, personal photographs, and told by those who knew him well.
When my grandfather was at home, everything revolved around him. It seemed to be a natural way of life.
This is the real Churchill. It's Winston Churchill's second Christmas as Prime Minister, and he's just arrived in America. After more than 2 years of blackouts in Britain, the festive lights of Washington, D.C. are a welcome sight. But Churchill's not here on holiday. He's here to change the course of the Second World War. When it's announced Churchill's in town, it's like a movie star has arrived. An adoring American public sends him thousands of presents.
He received boxes of cigars. I mean, he couldn't possibly have smoked them all. He received this giant V sign in flowers. Churchill wasn't very tall. He was 5'6", and this V would have dwarfed him.
The way that Britain stood alone, with Churchill as its figurehead when they themselves remained in isolation, was something that most Americans greatly admired.
But there's one man Churchill needs to impress: President Franklin D. Roosevelt.
Despite all the rhetoric of "we shall never surrender" and that the British would ultimately be victorious over Nazi Germany, Churchill really doesn't have much of a plan as to how he is going to be able to achieve victory without the United States.
Churchill has been invited to stay at the White House. It will be his home for the next 3 weeks.
He took one look at this room and said no, he didn't like it, and he just started wandering the halls of the White House trying to find a bedroom that he thought was more to his liking, much to the horror of the First Lady. Churchill, of course, eventually chose a bedroom that was directly opposite the president's, and he did so, of course, because he wanted to be as close as possible to Roosevelt.
Setting up camp as close to the president as possible is all part of Churchill's plan. He wants to get Roosevelt to back him in his struggle against the Nazis. He needs to act quickly. America is still reeling from the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor just 2 weeks ago. An attack that forced them to declare war on Japan and its ally Germany.
Churchill needs to ensure that the Americans, filled with rage about the Japanese surprise attack, are not going to pursue a war purely against Japan and leave Germany to a struggling Britain.
To do that, Churchill plans to begin by building a personal relationship with the president.
I often think it's misunderstood how important personal chemistry is at this sort of very high-level diplomacy, and that's certainly the case here. And Churchill could be unbelievably charming and persuasive and persistent. And I think initially Roosevelt was slightly starstruck by Churchill.
Churchill insisted on setting up what he called his map room in the White House so he could track the course of the war. It had an immediate impact on Roosevelt, who set up his own map room, which eventually became the Situation Room in the White House, which is still there today.
Churchill wheels the wheelchair-bound president around the White House. They walk in and out of each other's bedrooms the whole time. They have conversations late into the night. At one stage, Roosevelt is wheeled into Churchill's quarters just as Churchill is emerging naked from his bathroom, and at least one account of it has him saying, "You see, Mr. President, the British Prime Minister has nothing to hide from the American President." And they genuinely began to like each other.
Having enjoyed Christmas dinner with the Roosevelts, on Boxing Day, Churchill makes his way to Capitol Hill. He's about to make what will be one of his most important speeches of the war. He's been invited to address a joint meeting of Congress.
There had only been 2 joint meetings of Congress ever in American history before Churchill spoke to them, so this is a massive honor.
There was a great deal of anticipation and excitement, and people were desperate to try to get into the Senate chamber to be able to listen to Churchill's speech. It was absolutely packed.
Churchill's chances of victory in Europe rest on what he says next.
After Pearl Harbor, there remains a strong section of American public opinion that does not want to see the United States embroiled in the war in Europe and believes that the proper response to Pearl Harbor should be a concentration on the war against Japan. So while there is huge interest in Churchill personally, he is aware that he doesn't yet have all of the United States public opinion behind him.
Churchill knows that popular support is critical if he's going to get the Americans to fully back Britain against the Nazis.
Members of the Senate and guests of the Senate, Prime Minister of Great Britain, the Right Honourable Winston.
As Churchill approaches the microphones, his eyes fill with tears.
One of the interesting things about Churchill as a leader and as a public figure in this time is that he wasn't afraid or ashamed to show his emotions. This is a moment that he had been working towards and hoping for since he became Prime Minister in 1940.
Churchill's post-war secretary, Lady Williams, often saw his emotional side.
I remember he would sit there with tears pouring down his face, and he would say to me, "You've just got to get used to it, seeing a man cry."
I don't want to suggest that this was just purely image making, because he didn't just summon up tears, but I think that the fact that he was seen to be deeply moved was something which was of benefit to his image.
Even though Churchill knows how much is riding on this speech, he begins with a joke.
Here I am, an Englishman, welcomed in your midst. Makes this experience one of the most moving and thrilling in my life, which is already long and has not been entirely uneventful.
I think there's no doubt that Churchill relished the big occasions. This was someone who liked nothing better to be at the centre of events, and you don't get more central than this.
I wish indeed that my mother, whose memory I cherish across the veil of years, could have been here to see.
It's got all the hallmarks of a great Churchill speech. He talks of the ties of blood on his mother's side. His mother was an American heiress who came over and married a British aristocrat. So Churchill knows immediately that's how to plug into these people.
Churchill makes it clear that Britain and America share a common goal, a desire to do the right thing.
Here we are, together, facing a group of mighty foes who seek our ruin. Here we are, together, defending all that to free men is dear. What kind of a people do they think we are? Is it possible they do not realize that we shall never cease to persevere against them until they have been taught a lesson which they and the world will never forget?
He was aware as an orator that you need your speech to build. You can see him playing with the audience, using his rhetorical tricks and building towards the climax.
Still I avow my hope and faith, sure and inviolate, that in the days to come, the British and American people will, for their own safety and for the good of all, walk together in majesty, in justice, and in peace.
After just 30 minutes, Churchill has his audience in the palm of his hand.
The applause at the end of that speech is absolutely extraordinary. It goes on for minute after minute after minute. It's quite moving. It really gives one the sense that there's this special relationship between the United States and Great Britain that in many respects is still with us to this day.
A few days later, Churchill gets the best Christmas present of all. The Americans commit to backing him completely against Nazi Germany. Later that evening, Churchill is in his room at the White House.
Churchill is understandably elated, but he's also exhausted. A huge amount of physical effort goes into these orations.
He goes to open a window. Suddenly, he becomes short of breath. He feels pains in his chest.
The pressure that he's under is intense. He's also someone who doesn't live healthily. He smokes all those cigars, he drinks champagne, he takes no exercise whatsoever.
Churchill calls his personal doctor, Lord Moran.
Lord Moran said to him, "These are signs of coronary insufficiency, and you've been overdoing things." Churchill replied to him instantly, "You're not going to tell me to rest. I can't. I won't. Nobody else can do this job."
Having achieved his mission, Churchill sets off on the journey home.
Britain was glad to have Winston Churchill back and grateful for the job he'd done.
Back in Britain, Churchill should now be taking it easy. But he doesn't. Instead, he sets off on another exhausting journey that he feels he has to make. And he's determined to do it, even if it kills him.
Attention there, military history enthusiasts. Brace yourself for an unparalleled journey into the heart of warfare with History Hit, where the untold stories of desperate battles come to life. Join James Holland on a gripping road trip through Italy in Road to Victory, Italy 1943, uncovering the often overlooked campaign of the British 8th Army's landing and advance up the Italian peninsula in 1943. Next, explore the forgotten battlefields of the First World War with Alex Churchill, tracing the bloody battles that unfolded before the trenches, revealing the clash of modern weapons and Napoleonic tactics in a conflict that set the stage for the Great War. And finally, follow the one and only Rishi Sharma in Untold Stories of World War II as he raced against time to capture over 2,200 personal oral histories from living combat veterans, preserving the harrowing accounts of those who lived at the bleeding edge on the front line. Discover hundreds of hours of award-winning documentaries and ad-free podcasts with History Hit. Sign up for a special offer via the link in the description.
It's 6 months since Winston Churchill's successful trip to Washington, D.C., and his relationship with President Roosevelt is going from strength to strength.
With Roosevelt, there was a genuine affection. And he says, "I love that man."
The American chiefs of staff have come to London to discuss how the two allies are going to take on Hitler together. After 3 years of war, most of Europe has fallen to the Nazis. France is under German control. The American generals want to liberate Europe by sending their troops into northern France as soon as possible.
They had argued that having entered the war and having agreed to fight in Europe, the most obvious thing to do is to launch an attack into France, and then moving on, if Adolf Hitler is in Berlin, that's where you should be going.
But Churchill is worried that sending British troops across the Channel into France now could end in disaster. This is the battleground where almost 1 million British soldiers died in the First World War, something that still haunts Churchill to this day.
He felt, having spent time on the Western Front in the First World War, and just seeing them stuck, pointlessly losing lives, made him realise it needed to be a cautious attack. He needed to be super ready.
Churchill believes the Allies need more time to prepare for an invasion on this scale.
He knows that it's going to take time to build up forces to launch an effective operation in Western Europe through France.
For now, Churchill would rather use American troops elsewhere. For the past 2 years, Britain has not only been at war with the Nazis in Europe, it's also been defending British colonial interests in North Africa from invading Nazis and Italian fascists. Churchill is determined not to lose control of his beloved colonies.
The war was about defeating the Nazis, but it was also about protecting the British Empire. And Churchill had empire riven through his soul.
He needs to convince the Americans to help in North Africa before any invasion of France. And Churchill has a secret weapon to win this argument: his newly built special relationship with President Roosevelt.
Roosevelt takes great risks to back Churchill. Roosevelt makes decisions in terms of how America will fight the Second World War that are completely counter to what those around him are saying the United States should do. And I think that's a great testimony to Churchill.
But Roosevelt isn't the only person Churchill needs to convince. Since Hitler invaded Russia in 1941, Britain has been allied with the Soviet Union, led by Joseph Stalin. Stalin is furious that his allies want to delay joining the fight in Europe, where his Red Army is struggling against the Nazis.
Russia feels they're bearing the brunt and are bleeding in their hundreds of thousands into their own soil.
Churchill needs the Russians to hold off the Nazis in the east. But he is not prepared to take the pressure off Stalin by taking on the Nazis in France just yet. It's critical that Churchill keeps the Russians on side.
Churchill understood that without the Russians, the possibility of winning the war seemed impossible.
Churchill cooks up a plan. He'll use his charm against Stalin. He sets off for Moscow to convince the Soviet leader that the delay is necessary. Having just recovered from a near heart attack 8 months earlier, the journey is fraught with danger.
You have to remember that if these planes go above a certain altitude, you have to have oxygen. And Churchill, of course, has his oxygen mask adapted so that he can smoke.
Churchill arrives at the Kremlin to see Stalin. Despite having been allies for 2 years, the two men have never met. Churchill's determined to make the right first impression.
Churchill, in lots of ways, was the consummate all-round diplomat. He was very sensitive. You notice a similarity between the way the two men are dressed. Churchill is in his siren suit. What he's trying to do is to tell Stalin that he is one of the people.
Now, admittedly, his siren suits were tailored and often made of velvet. They were a costume.
After the initial introductions, the two men sit down for formal discussions.
Stalin fronts up to him and goes, "What is it? Are you scared of the Germans? When are you going to fight them properly, like we are?"
And this really riles Churchill. And at one point, he's on the verge of walking out and going home.
But Churchill can't leave. He must get Stalin to sign up to his plan and commit Russian troops to continue fighting the Nazis, allowing the Allies to delay their invasion of France and instead focus on North Africa. So he sits up with the Soviet leader late into the night.
Churchill was somebody who enjoyed dinner party diplomacy. Stalin liked to have a drink, and Churchill was the same, albeit vintage champagne as opposed to vodka.
Churchill's ability to consume alcohol, it's something that binds them together.
As the drinks continue to flow, Churchill seizes his moment.
Churchill makes a passionate defence of his determination to fight the Germans in North Africa. It's said that the translator was so awestruck by the force of Churchill's rhetoric and the passion that he stops translating. Although Stalin isn't able to understand most of what Churchill is saying, it's Churchill's fighting spirit that comes through.
Churchill's passion wins the day. Stalin accepts there will be no immediate attack on the Nazis in France. Churchill leaves Moscow with what he came for, and a hangover. But he still celebrates with champagne on the flight home. Three months later, instead of invading France, British and American troops land on the east coast of North Africa in Operation Torch.
It is a hugely significant action. Churchill has managed to accomplish the thing that he's tried the hardest to do. He is the one who has argued that American troops would be best placed landing in North Africa. Torch demonstrates that it's his opinion, it's his argument that has won the day.
Churchill has an incredible amount personally invested in the success of this mission. His only son Randolph is among the troops.
As soon as the action starts, then he's going to be there in his map room, he's going to be calling key advisors, he's going to be issuing minutes and telegrams to the chiefs of staff.
The whole great show went like magic, and General Eisenhower himself has attributed much of the success to the assistance given by Britain's combined operations, and the training and planning by our combined operations was great work.
Churchill orders church bells across the nation to ring out for the first time in 2.5 years in celebration.
For Churchill himself, it is a moment of triumph. His strategy has been proven to have been correct.
His success is even sweeter when he receives a letter from his son telling him he is safe and well. Churchill tells his secretary, "Tonight there is sugar on the cake." Just weeks later, there's even more good news for Churchill. The Soviets at last have the German army on the back foot in the east.
The Russian ring closes round the 6th German Army at Stalingrad. The history of warfare has never known such an encirclement and annihilation of so large a number of regular troops.
With the tide of the war turning, Churchill heads to the Iranian capital Tehran for an historic event. The three Allied war leaders are all meeting together for the first time.
From the supreme headquarters of Britain, the United States and the USSR bring to the capital of Persia the leaders of the war against Germany.
Churchill believes in face-to-face diplomacy between world leaders. This is part of the role that he relishes. He believes that these are the moments where you are making history.
Top of the agenda is deciding a date for Operation Overlord, the cross-channel invasion of Nazi-occupied northern France, an attack that will later become known as D-Day. It's an action Stalin has been demanding for years. There are rumors that if he doesn't get a commitment that D-Day will happen soon, he'll abandon the Allies and make a peace deal with Hitler. But Churchill wants to delay D-Day for as long as possible.
He fears that the only way that the Allies could now lose the war would be an unsuccessful invasion of the continent.
Churchill believes it will take 2 years to prepare for the invasion of northern France. That means delaying until 1945. Having got his way with both Roosevelt and Stalin before, he's confident he can get them to agree to his timetable.
Churchill sees himself as being the senior partner in this trio. He sees this as being the role that he was born to perform.
He sends a message to Roosevelt, who he regards as a friend. He asks to meet privately before the official talks begin.
Churchill expects Roosevelt to be on board. Roosevelt had always been very receptive to Churchill's thinking.
Roosevelt doesn't respond to his invitation.
Roosevelt was a better politician than Churchill in a way. He could be duplicitous when he wanted to be. He could be quite scheming. He could be ruthless. Churchill put a much higher value on friendship than Roosevelt did. Roosevelt just saw it as pure politics and what is best for what I want.
Having snubbed Churchill, Roosevelt then goes behind his back. He arranges a private meeting with Stalin, to which Churchill is not invited.
Roosevelt wants to develop a personal relationship with Stalin. Roosevelt recognizes that the Soviet Union is a power that is not going to disappear, and that if we're going to talk about maintaining world peace after the war, one of the critical factors in doing so is this relationship with the Soviets.
Soon after, the formal negotiations begin.
The dynamic between the big three at Tehran is really interesting. So you've got these three incredibly powerful individuals maneuvering around one another.
Stalin insists D-Day should take place in May 1944, just 6 months away.
Roosevelt is sitting in the room with Churchill and Stalin. He makes it a point to agree with Stalin that D-Day has to happen, and it has to happen in early May 1944.
Churchill tries to persuade them with his usual charm, but this time it doesn't work.
He'd become the half in an alliance of 2.5, the bit part player, the small one. Churchill clearly had an unrealistic belief in the impact of his own personality. No matter how many times you meet Roosevelt or try and build a personal relationship with the likes of Stalin, who actually is a deeply untrustworthy man, the agendas of the three countries were so very different.
Despite Churchill's best efforts, the date for D-Day is set for May 1944. Later that day, the three Allied war leaders pose for this photograph.
This is a very telling photograph. I think it kind of exemplifies the changed relationship between the three leaders and the three powers. When you look at Churchill, he looks like a man who is dejected. He's almost detached from the other two. Churchill was a very emotional man. He took these things to heart. The fact that Roosevelt was now wooing Stalin the same way that Churchill wooed Roosevelt in the early stages of the war really bruised Churchill's ego. Churchill found the whole experience at Tehran quite wounding.
Eight days later, Churchill arrives in Tunisia. With a date for D-Day now set, he wants to meet with the man who will lead the attack, American Supreme Commander General Eisenhower. Instead, Churchill wakes up with a temperature of 101 degrees. He's diagnosed with pneumonia. Then Churchill's heart starts showing signs of strain.
His doctor, Lord Moran, actually fears for his life. His wife, Clementine Churchill, is summoned to be at his bedside. There is a real possibility that he might die. What that illness represents is the huge stress and strain that he's been under.
Churchill is forced to take time out to recover. With one of the most important operations of the war just months away, Churchill's fears about being sidelined look like they're becoming a reality. Winston Churchill is heading for Southampton. The troops there are preparing for the most iconic moment of the Second World War, the D-Day landings.
There was a huge nervous tension for Churchill building about D-Day. And I think this had been building for some time, ever since the Tehran conference.
In just 4 days' time, British, Commonwealth and American troops will begin their invasion of German-occupied France. It's an operation that has been more than 6 months in the planning. The outcome will decide which side wins the Second World War. It could also be a pivotal moment in the relationship between the Allies. The Russians already have Germany on the run in the east. And soon, the number of American soldiers deployed will outnumber the British.
The reality is, as the war moves on, Churchill's position and power will start to dissipate and weaken.
He thinks, what's Britain got to offer? We don't have the troop numbers. We don't have the resources that these other two powers have. But we do have an incredibly charismatic leader who has credibility, who's held out and resisted and stayed in the war from the beginning. That's Churchill himself.
His wife, Clementine Churchill, described him as an egoist. There is a vanity there.
Churchill believes he's found a way to stamp his personality on D-Day and make it seem like a British victory. He will lead the attack from the front.
These plans would have seen the Prime Minister, he would have crossed the Channel on HMS Belfast and then transferred to a destroyer. And then landed on the beaches on D-Day itself.
No one else thinks Churchill's plan is a good idea. Especially General Eisenhower, the American in charge of the whole operation.
The last thing Eisenhower or any of the military commanders want is Churchill anywhere near the front on D-Day itself. It would be a huge added burden and risk.
But they can't stop him.
The only person under the British Constitution who can order Churchill not to go is the King. And the interesting thing there is that even then, it takes 2 handwritten letters from the King before Churchill finally and grudgingly admits that he has to respect the King's wishes and can't go.
It's not his turn to be in the limelight in that moment. This is about the men on the beaches, and it would have been thoroughly irresponsible.
Less than 24 hours before D-Day, Churchill heads back to Downing Street. All he can do now is wait and watch from the sidelines.
He said to his wife, Clementine, "You do realise that by this time tomorrow morning, 10,000 men may have been killed." You can see how much it would have been preying on his mind.
The next morning, the D-Day landings begin. 160,000 British, Commonwealth and American soldiers are put ashore on 5 beaches in Normandy. It's the first time British troops have successfully engaged the Germans on French soil in 4 years.
Everything went like clockwork, and that's saying something when you consider the size and complication of the plan to liberate Europe. This was the climax of months of intensive work, for this was D-Day.
It's 6 days later. More than 300,000 Allied troops have landed in France and have liberated a stretch of coast 50 miles long. With the landing zone considered safe, Churchill at last gets his chance to cross the Channel. This photograph was taken of Churchill as he stepped ashore in France.
This is one of Churchill's happiest moments of the wartime experience. He looks extremely contented. He looks as if this is the place that he, in his mind, is very much meant to be, and that is going into harm's way, potentially, going to where the fight is taking place.
Churchill is met by British Commander Field Marshal Montgomery, who drives him 5 miles inland to his headquarters. It's the first time he's travelled through France since it fell to the Nazis 4 years earlier.
The return to France is a hugely significant moment for Churchill. The first few weeks of his premiership in 1940 had been dominated by the fall of France. The return to France brings things full circle.
He's feted in the streets by the French people. You know, this is Churchill. This is the man who has told them that Britain will not forget them and that Britain will come back and will liberate them. And here he is now, and it moves him deeply. The fascination that exists today with Churchill existed then as well. The force of personality that exists and the impact that he has on a nation.
This isn't enough for Churchill. He can see the smoke from the front line just a few miles away and wants to see the action. But no one will let him get any closer.
He was indignant that during his visit he'd actually not seen any fighting. He had not personally felt himself in danger. There were so many times in his life where Churchill put himself in harm's way in pursuit of what could be described as a surge of excitement, a rush of adrenaline, what he called daring do.
Later that day, crossing the Channel home, Churchill asked the captain of his ship to open fire on German positions. The captain agrees to his request. Churchill compliments him on his sporting spirit.
There's this huge part of Churchill, even though it's in a sort of 70-year-old body by this stage, that, wants to be a soldier.
Churchill loved nothing more to be in the thick of the action, and he would have relished the end of that long day, which saw him on board a British warship firing the guns at the enemy.
Churchill's had a taste of the action, but it's not enough. Next time, he'll make sure nothing stops him from getting to the front line. Winston Churchill has just arrived in the Netherlands. He's hot on the heels of British, Commonwealth and American forces who have fought their way to the River Rhine. Having been prevented from being part of D-Day, Churchill isn't going to miss out on the moment British troops enter the heartlands of Germany.
Churchill sees this as being the finale. This is the final push across this last barrier that he recognises as being the defensive position that Germany's relied upon throughout its history, and the last time an invading army had actually crossed the Rhine by boat was Napoleon.
The King noted in his diary, Churchill was utterly determined to be part of it. He's very restless nowadays and cannot bear to be out of things.
But Churchill doesn't just want to witness this historic moment. He needs to make his presence felt.
He has a hard time accepting that Britain is playing a junior role now in this great struggle against the Axis. And part of the way he can make up for that is to go to the battlefield.
He borrows a plane to get a look at the front from the air. Flying at just 500 feet, he could be brought down by a slingshot.
Churchill's like a kind of child in a sweet shop. He's going to want the biggest piece of bubble gum. He's going to want to be right there where the action is. He's just such a giant ego.
He romanticised the idea of dying in battle, and possibly thought that if he were to die after this supreme struggle which he had led Britain through so successfully, this would be a rather fitting end to his life, almost like Nelson dying at the Battle of Trafalgar.
When he returns to HQ, Churchill discovers his private secretary covered in blood. A shell exploded just meters away from his jeep. Churchill tells him, "I'm jealous." The Prime Minister goes to bed determined that tomorrow, nothing will stop him from getting to the front line. The next morning, Churchill heads straight for the banks of the River Rhine. Here, he meets American Commander General Eisenhower.
He has a great line for him. He says, "My dear General, the German is whipped. We've got him. He is all through." He looks sprightly. He looks energized. He looks a man in his element.
Churchill insists on going to the most shelled bit of the bank. And that is, of course, a massive headache. It's not going to look too good for the military command if they lose Britain's key figurehead. And apparently he says, "Well, I'm an old man and I've worked hard. Why shouldn't I have a little fun?"
And that's exactly what Churchill intends to do.
Churchill actually notices a motor launch that's parked on the river and suggests to Montgomery that they jump in and head across. And Montgomery very happily says, "Sure, why not?"
It's at this moment that Churchill appears to be those two almost contradictory parts of his character, both supreme war leader and naughty schoolboy.
Churchill is now crossing the 400 yards of the River Rhine, headed for the heart of enemy territory.
He is clearly delighted. Germany really was Hitler's fortress, the Reich which had meant to last for 1,000 years. And here is Churchill entering the fortress.
Churchill knows that even in this moment, he's reliant on the support of his allies.
Just check in the motorboat how many men are chewing gum. Most of those men surrounding Churchill are Americans. And that really is this kind of subliminal message about where the power really lay. It lies with America and with Russia. And that's the future.
This is Churchill's attempt to make up for that loss of power.
He puts himself very deliberately at the heart of the story. He is sort of instinctively aware of where the cameras are. He is aware of the impact of his own appearance.
You have to ask at this point, why was our Prime Minister in a military uniform? This constant cigar that he waggles about and plays with and fiddles with and puffs on. I refuse to believe he was that dependent on nicotine. He was a man who understood the power of the prop. The cigar, I think, made him greater than the sum of his parts, and he knew it. Imagine Churchill without the cigar and the costume. He's a slightly undersized bald man of 70.
On the eastern bank of the Rhine, Churchill takes in his defeated enemy.
This was still the front line of the war, filled with danger. There are snipers all around in front of him, and at that moment, shells began to hit. The general explains that he can no longer accept responsibility for Churchill being there and that he must leave. The look on Winston's face was just like that of a small boy being called away from his sandcastles on the beach by his nurse. It was a sad wrench for him. He was enjoying himself immensely.
This crossing of the Rhine is incredibly emotional for him. It's a tremendous moment of history, and he recognizes that.
When he went to inspect the bomb damage during the Blitz, he famously promised the people who were standing amongst the rubble and the ruins that he would give it them back. As he crossed the Rhine, he would have seen that moment as a fulfillment of that promise.
Churchill could sense that all his hard work was finally paying off. Just days after he became Prime Minister, he pledged he would give his blood, his toil, and tears and sweat. And that's what it's taken to get to the stage where victory's just a few weeks away.
Winston Churchill, a giant of history, famous for his inspiring leadership.
Advance, Britannia! Long live the cause of freedom!
But behind the legend lies a complicated character.
People tend to see Churchill, the icon, Churchill, the bulldog warrior, and of course, that's not the whole story.
He was an aristocrat and a man of the people.
It says a lot for his charisma and his humility that he was accepted and liked.
A trailblazer who also had questionable beliefs.
He is an old-school imperialist. He calls Indian people the dusky nation.
This is the story of the man behind the myth, using rarely seen footage, personal photographs, and told by those who knew him well.
When my grandfather was at home, everything revolved around him. It seemed to be a natural way of life.
This is the real Churchill. This time, it's 1945, and the last summer of the Second World War. Prime Minister Winston Churchill has led Britain to the brink of victory, but he's far from done.
He's absolutely desperate to carry on and doesn't believe that anyone could do what he could do.
Churchill calls a general election. He expects voters will give him another 5 years at number 10.
It never crossed their mind that the election was going to be lost.
Churchill is in for a shock. It's VE Day 1945. After 5 years of war, all over Britain, people are partying in the streets because Nazi Germany has just surrendered. With Japan still fighting, the Second World War is far from over. But victory in Europe is huge.
VE Day is a day of national celebration. So you can see from all the newsreel footage what a tremendous outpouring of emotion and relief there is.
In central London, the streets are taken over by hundreds of thousands of people. They all have one thing in mind.
There is one man who's like a lightning conductor for all this emotion. One man that the people want to see even above and beyond the king on that day. It's Winston Churchill, who seems for so many people to have personified this tremendous effort to escape from the clutches of a very, very grave threat to national existence.
Churchill leaves Buckingham Palace and joins the throng.
Whenever he tries to go anywhere in his open-top car, he is absolutely mobbed, and people are just so excited and happy to see him.
The climax of this adoration of Churchill comes late that afternoon. He's at this government building overlooking Parliament Square. He emerges onto the balcony here to give a short speech to the crowd below.
And when there is that wonderful moment where he opens with, "This is your victory," and the crowd immediately roars back, "No, it is yours," you can sense just how much of a sense of gratitude and appreciation there is towards Winston Churchill, who is quite clearly on that day being seen as the architect of victory.
Churchill returns to Downing Street. He earlier made sure the capital won't run out of beer, and outside his front door, the street party continues deep into the night. But Churchill is hard at work, dealing with his usual evening correspondence. A pile of urgent telegrams 6 inches high. Tonight, many are congratulatory. One, from a close associate, seems to sum up the nation's feelings. All my thoughts are with you on this day, which is essentially your day. It is you who have led, uplifted, and inspired us through the worst days. Without you, this day would not have been.
He was the hero of the whole country. People were shouting and cheering at my grandfather. It was an extraordinary day.
He was almost all-powerful. The man was now a legend.
I think you can go even further than that. He's almost seen like a Christ-like figure, a man who kind of had taken the nation's sufferings on his own shoulder and had walked the nation through those dark days and inspired courage and confidence.
Churchill is also a broken man.
If you see any footage of Churchill during May 1945, when the war is over, here's another thing. He looks knackered. He looks absolutely worn out.
He was in his 71st year, and he was physically far from his old self. But the fact was that he was exhausted. He was a man of astonishing resilience, but he was not young.
I think it's interesting to juxtapose this image of Churchill in May 1945 with some of the images that we've seen of him entering Downing Street in May 1940. The figure is still ostensibly the same. You've got the same dress, you've got the same bow tie, you've got the omnipresent cigar, but you can see the ravages of the war and the result of the premiership on his face and in his bearing. He looks less steady, less confident than he did 5 years before.
He was exhausted. The stress level must have been terrific, but he kept going. And so by the time they got to V-Day, if you imagine when you've run a double marathon and you stop, you want to collapse. And I'm sure at the end of the war, he wanted to collapse.
Throughout the 5 years he's been Britain's war leader, Churchill has pushed his body to the limits. He suffered a suspected heart attack and 3 bouts of pneumonia.
He's having to be carried out of key meetings in the underground cabinet war rooms by groups of Marines because he's no longer capable of getting up the steep stairs.
His wife Clementine is so worried about his health, she thinks it's time for drastic action.
She wants him to retire. He has done his duty for his country. He's done it brilliantly. Now is the time to step back and do other things, enjoy himself, not put himself under such pressure. And that she's worried that otherwise his health will give way completely and that this might be the only way that he can extend his life. Of course, she suspects he might not have much time left.
Despite his exhaustion, Churchill does not agree with his wife about giving up his premiership.
He's absolutely desperate to carry on. Churchill really thinks that he is kind of the key to the post-war era. He has a huge appreciation of his own role and doesn't believe that anyone could do what he could do.
Churchill's first plan for staying in power is to keep everything as it is. Throughout the war, parliamentary rivalries and general elections have been set aside. And though Churchill is a conservative, his government is not. He's invited leading figures from all the parties to serve in his war cabinet.
And it's a real testament to the political skill of Churchill that they've managed to keep this show on the road for such a long time.
When we think of Winston Churchill now, we tend to think of him as this sort of bulldog warrior, very obstinate, set on getting his own way, stubborn. The truth was that he could often be far more consultative and collaborative.
Even though Germany is now defeated, Churchill wants to keep his all-party government going.
This is a way that he would kind of guarantee that he would maintain his position in Downing Street. He's been very successful at playing the 3 main parties off against one another and make sure that he's kind of indispensable in the middle.
2 weeks after VE Day, Churchill gets a phone call with bad news. It's from Blackpool, where the Labour Party is having their annual conference. They've decided to pull out of the war cabinet and so end Churchill's all-party government.
Churchill is rather crestfallen by this and wanted to keep things going, but Churchill's desire is simply not going to be fulfilled.
There is now only one way Churchill can stay in power. Even though the war is still going on, he'll have to call a general election. Churchill asks his colleagues if he'll win.
According to the experts around Churchill, Churchill's own towering personal popularity, allied to the VE Day feel-good factor, well, there's a sense in which those two things might well deliver to the Conservatives a pretty decent victory.
Churchill is told he'll get a majority of at least 60.
He'd expected victory because this was what all the most expert observers had told him was to be expected.
Even the Labour Party experts predict Churchill will win. But experts can be wrong. It's a few days since Churchill's all-party government collapsed. In the gardens at number 10, the men who served in it are having a last get-together. These are the politicians from all parties who've helped Churchill defeat Nazi Germany.
And there is a good bit of alcohol taken, there's a lot of backslapping, they're quaffing a glass or two together and reminiscing.
Churchill can be seen here walking beside Labour leader Clement Attlee. These two men should be political enemies, but they've worked together for 5 difficult years and they've become close.
Attlee certainly has a huge degree of reverence for Churchill, and he's really in awe of Churchill's rhetorical ability. And of course, he's seen Churchill up close and personal for the last 5 years. He's seen the weight of decisions that have been on his shoulders.
There's a definite kind of chalk and cheese aspect of their personalities, but I would say it's a relationship of mutual respect.
Having welcomed Attlee and his colleagues, Churchill makes an emotional speech.
He declares that it was only through this united political front that the country overcame the peril that had faced it, that Churchill believes that history will look back on this 5-year period and will laud all of those who took part in it. All the accounts of that event tell us that Churchill is in a deeply emotional state. He was not shy of showing that emotion in public and in private. That's a very well-known facet of Churchill's personality.
As soon as his guests go home, Churchill drives to Buckingham Palace to meet the King. He's firing the starting gun of the general election.
And in elections, Churchill thinks there's only one goal, and that is to win. It's like a switch flips in Churchill's head. He is on the stump. He is the old campaigning warhorse. And Churchill is not beyond, nor has he been beyond in some 15 or 16 parliamentary elections in his career, in stepping into the gutter from time to time, and in maybe delivering the odd blow below the belt.
Churchill is a fighter, and he likes nothing better than to be in the fray. He cannot envisage a political campaign where he holds back and where he doesn't say what he thinks.
It's the first weekend of campaigning for the general election. Churchill is at the PM's official country residence, Chequers. He's hard at work writing the script of a speech with which he'll kick-start his campaign.
There is no accidental literary flourishes in a Churchill speech. He creates these, he hones these, he perfects his speeches. And that's, what everybody expects of him.
Churchill has a plan. He intends to make people vote for him by scaring them away from his rival for number 10, Labour leader Clement Attlee.
What he wants to do is present Attlee as the kind of dangerous threat.
Mr. Attlee hands in his deposit money at Stepney Town Hall.
Churchill is about to make a huge mistake. He intends to describe Attlee as a left-wing extremist whose government would be, in Churchill's words, harsh, clumsy, and tyrannical, reliant on secret police. Churchill wants to use the term Gestapo.
If you play word association, you say to somebody in Britain Gestapo, And they are instantly going to come back with some kind of Nazi image, some kind of brute totalitarian force. So to put that phrase in is really kind of incendiary.
Pleased with his dirty attack on Attlee, Churchill shows a draft of his speech to his wife Clementine.
For him to say this, to equate Labour, the Gestapo, Clementine probably looked at with horror. And it was also an absurd thing to say, as far as she was concerned. She was a great friend of Clement Attlee's, and she pleaded with him to take the mention out.
But Churchill refuses.
When you look at the original speech, you can see that it is heavily edited over the course of its creation by Winston Churchill. There are numerous alterations and additions throughout. But interestingly, that mention of the Gestapo is one of the few lines that is unedited.
The next day, ignoring Clementine's advice, Churchill goes on the radio to deliver his speech.
In Great Britain, we do not like to be regimented and ordered about and have every action of our lives prescribed for us. Our present opponents have to fall back on some form of Gestapo.
It's quite a shocking transition. He is really insulting even the patriotism of those very men with whom on VE Day he shared a balcony. I might add that he thought that that speech would be looked back on as one of the greatest of his career. Well, that actually hasn't happened.
One of the first to react to the Gestapo speech is Attlee. Churchill's former wartime colleague has now become his enemy.
Attlee leaped on Churchill's Gestapo remark and took the opportunity to remind voters that Churchill, the wartime leader, had been replaced by Churchill, the leader of the Conservative Party, remarking, "I thank him for having disillusioned them so thoroughly."
Public opinion seems to side with Attlee.
To many people, Churchill has really gone way, way over the top. To some people, it's more than just a kind of political gaffe, it's actively offensive. The mask of the national leader is finally slipped. Here is the Churchill of old.
So the headline on the Daily Herald the next day is Churchill's crazy broadcast. Churchill, who's on a pedestal, very much admired as the war leader, and then is portrayed as somebody who's actually abandoned his best qualities. What the Gestapo comment does is give people the opportunity to label him as having gone out of control.
It just seemed to confirm that Churchill was perhaps ill-suited to lead the peace. And I think what is sad about that is during the war, he had such an instinct for the words needed to connect with the British public. But in 1945, and especially with that Gestapo speech, that instinct sadly seemed to have vanished.
Even Churchill realizes this, and he's devastated. Clementine writes to their daughter that Churchill is very low, poor darling. He thinks he has lost his touch and grieves about it. But Churchill is not giving up the fight. Despite his exhaustion, he decides that to win over the British public, he needs to do something he's done many times before: hit the campaign trail.
As a campaigner over the course of his life, Winston Churchill has been known for having huge amounts of energy, for being able to really win a crowd and charm a room. But understandably, by the 1945 election campaign, he has lost some of that energy.
This is the man who'd become such a legendary orator during the Second World War, but you see him on the stump. He's tired, he's drawn.
Churchill is also weighed down by a heavy burden. He's not just campaigning for himself, but his entire party. Hundreds of MPs expect to be re-elected thanks to the Churchill factor.
The Conservative Party campaign is built around Churchill, and it's all about Churchill.
The hope was that Winston Churchill and his popularity as a wartime leader would translate into a win at the polls.
Churchill is not the force he was at the start of the war. His performances are tired. But he hopes that all he has to do is show up to remind people why they should vote for him.
He gets huge crowds wherever he goes. He's kind of mobbed at various train stations where it stops. And wherever Churchill goes, cameras will follow.
Churchill carries on the campaign, but he tells a friend he's as tired as he's ever been. And when he reaches the Midlands, there are signs that the wheels are coming off Churchill's election bandwagon.
Of course, the coverage of this is very upbeat and very positive.
We saw very large, enthusiastic crowds.
And perhaps masks an underlying truth. And it's a truth that was spelt out by the News Chronicle, which when they reported this tour, said Mr. Churchill visits the East Midlands, cheers for him, but not for the Tories. And of course, in the piece that we're watching, you're seeing very much the cheers for him, but according to some of the journalists there was an underlying current of opposition to the Conservative Party.
Relying on big rallies rather than meeting people one-on-one, Churchill has no idea what voters really think.
Churchill didn't sense that people were in fact saying to him, "Thank you for what you've done, you've led us superbly." He didn't realise that it was an expression of thanks rather than an expression of determination to vote for the Conservative Party and its allies in the coming election.
Churchill just doesn't get Britain of 1945. He cannot see how people have been changed by the last 5 years.
Many men have died in the Second World War. Women have contributed hugely to the effort. There's a youthfulness, an optimism. People wanted an end to wartime austerity and a guarantee that there would be no return to pre-war economic depression. People wanted opportunity, better healthcare, a social security system, housing and pensions and education for their young.
Churchill worries doing this could cost the taxpayer too much money.
Churchill was much more shy about promising to find large sums of money, which he said we don't have for the moment, and we can't be sure of having until we know how soon the war ends in the Far East and what it's cost us.
Churchill won't even promise voters free healthcare for all. If he's elected, the NHS might never get off the ground.
He's deeply concerned that the financial position that Britain is in after the war is going to be so perilous that the country might not even have enough money really to pay for food, let alone to pay for new hospitals.
This doesn't go down well with the British public.
Churchill, the war hero, struggled with an offer that met the needs of the moment. This reinforced the public's perception that he was a man of war and not a suitable peacetime leader.
Churchill still thinks his wartime leadership will win him the election. He cannot imagine that Britons don't want him. But he's about to have an unpleasant surprise. There are just weeks until the election. Winston Churchill needs to find a way to convince Britons to re-elect him as Prime Minister. He's also still fighting the war.
The gloves are off in this brutal struggle at the front door to Tokyo.
Though Germany is beaten, Japan fights on.
Churchill is looking for ending the Japanese war through an invasion and also retaking those lost territories of the British Empire in that part of the world.
At the time of which we're speaking, it was still expected that the war against Japan would continue for another 18 months and consume an immense amount of money.
Churchill can't imagine he'll be voted out when the war still rages. So, in a filmed election address, he tries to rally voters by reminding them that defeating Japan will involve one final struggle.
5 years ago, I promised you blood, toil, tears, and sweat. Once again, now, today, I must tell you that in spite of all our victories, a rough road lies ahead.
I'm exhausted watching it. We've been through 5-6 years of war, and Churchill offers us more work, more effort, more striving. It's a vision of a tough world. A realistic one, but maybe not the one that you were hoping for after such a great effort already.
The speech doesn't go down well.
If you look at contemporary accounts, diaries, eyewitness accounts, even read the newspapers from June 1945, you can see that many people, understandably perhaps, think it's all over bar the shouting, that the real big event was the war in Europe, and that was the one that placed the country in immediate peril, threatened the survival of the nation. Well, that threat has now lifted.
And the problem is that the British public at this point just want to return to some sort of normality. They want to know about how the new government will deal with things like the high cost of living and housing and cost of coal. That's the sort of thing that they want answers to.
Churchill is talking about the wrong things.
He still was so focused on winning the war, so he was distracted. Clementine is very worried that he is losing sight of what life is like without war. What she kept trying to persuade him to do was to think and talk about post-war peacetime Britain. It was time for Churchill to sort of start looking at what was happening at home, but he simply couldn't.
Churchill seems out of tune with the ordinary people of 1945 Britain. He's also out of date. Whoever wins this election will lead the country into the second half of the 20th century. Churchill was born 71 years ago in a palace during the reign of Queen Victoria.
When you look at Winston Churchill, he does appear quite Victorian. You'll see him wearing top hats and three-piece suits and watches with chains going across, and one could say you're looking at someone who appears out of touch with modern-day Britain.
Churchill really hadn't been on a bus in his life. He'd only been on the tube once on the Circle Line when he'd gone round and round, someone had to send down to rescue him. He didn't carry cash around like the royal family.
Churchill is so out of touch, he can't see it.
But Clementine was his direct line to people. People wrote to her in the thousands. She had this huge postbag. She did talk to people and did read these letters. And I suspect she could sense that support was ebbing away from her husband.
Soon, others in Churchill's close family are also sounding alarm bells.
Both his daughters, Mary and Sarah, warn him that many of the people they know in uniform are thinking of voting Labour.
Even the opinion polls are predicting that Churchill will lose. The polls are shown to his close advisers, but they ignore them, believing them to be a mistake.
People didn't set the same store on opinion polls in those days as we tend to now. So the fact that the opinion poll is showing something which appears to be absurd, nobody really believed this could possibly be true. So Churchill doesn't find out about the opinion polls until, I think, the year after the election.
Time is running out for Churchill. He travels to Walthamstow in northeast London for his final pre-election rally.
Can you hear me? Ladies and gentlemen.
So what you see is Churchill attempting to deliver his speech in front of a large audience in London, very clearly being heckled by what is a substantial part of the crowd.
Churchill appears quite thrown by it.
Nothing is easier. Nothing is easier. Nothing is easier than to prevent free speech.
This is someone who is very used to speaking over crowds and doesn't usually lose momentum in that way.
What you're seeing here is, of course, that this is something that Churchill was not used to. He'd been used to largely positive, largely appreciative crowds, particularly in very recent weeks. And so, yes, he looks rattled by this.
Therefore, a great effort is made on all these points. And when we are asked...
It looks like you've got Lady Churchill towards the left, sort of straining to see and to work out what's going on, what's being shouted.
It soon becomes clear that the crowd are chanting, "We want Labour."
You've got someone from the right whose head is literally in his hands at that point.
Which the socialists will gather.
Then the booing starts.
Ladies and gentlemen.
Walthamstow is an embarrassment and a sign that Churchill may be in deep trouble. Finally realizing how out of touch he is with British voters, Churchill admits, "I have nothing to offer them." But then comes news that changes everything. America has exploded an atomic weapon at a secret test site. Nothing has survived within a mile of the blast.
Will this power, now available to man, be made to rule out war and open a new, progressive chapter of history, the atomic age?
So Churchill is tremendously excited and boosted by the news that the United States has tested this A-bomb. This is a weapon to be used against Japan. This is a weapon that could bring the war against Japan to an early finish without the need for a hideously costly Allied invasion. This is, in Churchill's mind, a war-winning weapon.
There isn't time to drop the bomb before the election results come in. But Churchill is still optimistic he'll win the vote, despite being booed at Walthamstow. So he's excited about helping to shape the atomic age during his next 5 years in power. 2 days before the votes are counted, Churchill tells a friend, "I have great plans in store."
I think for Churchill, there is always an element of being part of history and wanting to be seen as part of history. Churchill likes nothing more than to be at the centre of great events.
But the night before the count, Churchill has a dreadful premonition.
So Churchill goes to bed that night, and I think he goes to bed with some degree of confidence. Thinks that Churchill's going to get a majority of 70 or 80. And according to his own, maybe slightly romanticised account, he said that he woke up in the early hours of the 26th of July with sort of sudden, sharp pain. He said it was almost like a physical pain. But what it really was a fear that the power to shape the future, just as he'd had the power to shape the war in a way, was going to be taken away from him.
This is Churchill's worst nightmare.
Churchill retains this deep view that without him, everything that he has fought for, both in the Second World War and all throughout his life, could be at stake.
It's results day at 10 Downing Street.
And it's around about 10 o'clock in the morning that the first results begin to emerge.
When the result for North Paddington was declared, it read, General Mason McFarlane wins Labour game.
Always a late riser, Churchill is still in his morning bath when he gets the first results. His aide, Captain Pym, enters the bathroom to tell him that so far there have been 10 Labour gains.
Churchill said something entirely characteristic and, to my mind, entirely admirable. He said something like this: the people have a perfect right to vote for another party. That is what we've been fighting for. Hand me my towel.
As soon as he's dressed, Churchill goes to the map room across the road from number 10.
Churchill loved his map room. He loved information, particularly visual information. One of the ways in which he relaxes, in a way, throughout the war is to make his way down to the map room and to study the evidence.
Today, it's the election results that are being displayed on the walls of the map room, constituency by constituency, as they come in.
And those results are also showing a tsunami of Labour gains. And the writing is well and truly on the wall. Churchill hangs around in that map room, his sort of makeshift election HQ, for the next couple of hours. I think he's solemn and stoical, quite quiet for Churchill, as you'd expect.
By late morning, there's no denying it. It's clear that Churchill has lost the election.
I was with the two people who were with him on the day that the election results came through, and they both told me they all sat in 10 Downing Street, and they all three had a good cry together. Because he'd been killing himself for the last 6 years, and then suddenly he's rejected. And I think he felt that he'd been terribly let down after it all.
It certainly does have a powerful emotional effect, as I'm sure it does on any leader who's defeated, but it is probably harder given that it was so unexpected.
By lunchtime, it's clear Churchill hasn't just lost, he's been absolutely crushed.
Newspapers carried the astonishing news to an amazed public. For let's face it, whoever imagined such a result? And slowly the moral of it all struck home. Labour landslide.
Churchill returns to number 10 for what was supposed to be a celebratory lunch.
Mary Churchill, his youngest daughter, recalled that we lunched in gloom. You can imagine this was not a happy meal. By then, absolutely, the writing was not just on the wall, it was on the cutlery they were using, it was on the plate, it was on the tablecloth. There was no escaping the reality of this.
The atmosphere was incredibly gloomy, and then Clementine tries to sort of cheer him up and say, well, you know, maybe it's a blessing in disguise.
To which he replied, in that case, it seems very effectively disguised.
But I think what she meant by that was, well, you know, you might survive a bit longer, you know, if you don't actually have to do this job anymore.
At 7 that evening, Churchill makes the journey he hoped he'd never have to make, to Buckingham Palace, to hand in his resignation to the King. This is a photo of him setting off from Downing Street.
I see the face of a man trying to put on a brave face. He's a man who's very used to the cameras. He's the great icon of his day, and he's been used to putting on a show. He is a showman. And I see here a man bravely attempting to do that one more time.
Churchill meets the King as his Prime Minister for the final time. Then he returns to the building where only 11 weeks ago he'd celebrated VE Day.
He spends the evening sitting in a publicly viewable window in Whitehall, waving and giving victory signs and so on. Of course, this would be unpleasant for anybody. It's a form of rejection, and the fact that the election campaign has been driven so much around his own personal image, it actually then makes it a very seemingly personal rejection as well.
The following day, he moves out of Downing Street.
I see here Churchill hunched over. You can see him walking in no great hurry, downcast. He's grieving for the loss of office.
Winston told his doctor, Lord Moran, it would have been better to have died in the war. I mean, that's how he felt about it.
In time, Churchill will be remembered for the glory of VE Day, rather than the electoral defeat that followed. And despite being turfed out of number 10, he never loses his faith in the people's right to choose.
Inevitably, he is down, but he comes out of it. I would be inclined to take what he says at face value. They're perfectly entitled to vote for who they please. This is democracy. This is what we've been fighting for. You can't have it two ways. You either believe in democracy or you don't. And he does.
Winston Churchill, a giant of history, famous for his inspiring leadership.
Advance, Britannia. Long live the cause of freedom.
But behind the legend lies a complicated character.
People tend to see Churchill the icon, Churchill the bulldog warrior, and of course, that's not the whole story.
He was an aristocrat and a man of the people.
It says a lot for his charisma and his humility that he was accepted and liked.
A trailblazer who also had questionable beliefs.
He is an old-school imperialist. He calls Indian people the dusky nation.
This is the story of the man behind the myth, using rarely seen footage, personal photographs, and told by those who knew him well.
When my grandfather was at home, everything revolved around him. It seemed to be a natural way of life.
This is the real Churchill. This time, we'll discover Churchill's final years.
This great hero kept fighting until the very end.
Churchill's reckless behaviour in old age threatens to jeopardise his place in history.
Churchill, the British bulldog, is looking much more like a playboy.
Before one of the most elaborate funerals Britain has ever seen seals his legacy for generations to come.
You would have been struck by the sense that you yourself were witnessing history.
It's been 17 years since Winston Churchill led the country to victory in the Second World War. The two-time Prime Minister and celebrated war hero is seeing out his days in style in Monte Carlo.
Churchill loved going to Monte Carlo. He loved the glamour of the place. He was someone who always enjoyed mixing with the rich and famous, and he enjoyed sailing and cruising.
He's staying at the Hôtel de Paris with his 19-year-old granddaughter, Celia.
The Hôtel de Paris was very luxurious, 20 steps from the casino, and beautiful views overlooking the sea and overlooking the harbour with all the wonderful yachts in it. It was absolutely amazing.
Churchill and Celia have been in Monte Carlo for a few days. While Churchill is frail, he's enjoying himself hugely. Then, early one morning, Churchill falls out of bed. The 87-year-old lies on the floor, unable to move. He fears this could be the end. After nearly an hour of agony, Churchill's discovered. He's rushed to the nearest hospital. Churchill's granddaughter Celia and his private secretary, Anthony Montague Brown, rushed to his bedside.
Anthony said, "Celia, you must prepare yourself. He's not going to make it." And I realised that this was serious.
At the hospital, the doctors discovered Churchill's broken his hip and needs emergency surgery.
He was lying in bed looking incredibly frail, surrounded by more medical staff than you'd imagine there could possibly be in the hospital. And he sort of rallied enough strength and dismissed them all and turned to Anthony and said, "I want to die in England. You'll make sure that happens, won't you?" And he didn't get an instant reply. So he said, "Promise me, Anthony." So Anthony said, "I promise." But as we went back to the hotel, Anthony said, "You know, Celia, that's a promise I don't think I'm going to be able to keep."
To carry out Churchill's dying wish, his private secretary acts quickly. He calls Prime Minister Harold Macmillan.
He's absolutely adamant, as is Churchill, that he should not die in France.
Churchill's reputation, Churchill's whole claim to greatness, is that he was the man who rescued Britain during the Second World War. So for this British hero to die while in a luxury penthouse in a hotel in the south of France, this is not appropriate.
Macmillan immediately sends an RAF jet to get Churchill back to Britain alive. The next morning, accompanied by his granddaughter, Churchill starts the journey home.
I sat next to him, and all I could do was to hold his hand and hope and pray that he would make it. By the time we got to Heathrow, he didn't seem to be any better. But he caught sight of a little group of airport workers, and they were absolutely silent and looking distraught. And he seemed to get a dose of adrenaline. And he smiled, and he gave them a V sign, and they clapped, and I knew that he was going to be all right.
I love that Churchill flashed the V for victory sign as he was on a stretcher, and I think that really dramatically shows his awareness of his public image.
By the time he arrives at a central London hospital, crowds have gathered to catch a glimpse of the ailing Churchill.
Churchill does appear like a rock star in this footage. Huge crowds gathering around him as he's wheeled out, waiting to get a view of their hero. I think it brings home to you the extent that he was an international celebrity in this period.
In plaster from thigh to ankle and strapped onto a stretcher, the old warrior was gently lifted out. We all joined Lady Churchill and his family in praying for a complete recovery.
"55 days later, Churchill is carried out of the hospital to rounds of applause.
When has there been a man to compare with Winston Churchill?
And what a crush there was to be among the first to see him.
Because the cigar and the V sign become his trademarks. You know, everyone imagines that he was constantly smoking a cigar. But the fact is that the cigar was lit as he went out of the house. He knew he must keep the public happy and give them a cigar and a V sign.
Less than a year later, Churchill is recovered and on his way back to Monte Carlo.
Churchill, the British bulldog, you'd have expected him to spend his time watching cricket, drinking warm beer, very English things, but he can't wait to get out of England and live the life of a sort of luxurious lizard in the south of France.
The journey there is a performance.
He didn't travel light, he took huge quantities of luggage. And we'd arrive at Nice airport, we'd go with a motorcycle escort from Nice to Monte Carlo, and then we'd go to the Hotel de Paris where we would arrive, and that's where we'd be staying. My grandfather, he'd have the whole suite on the top floor, which was very nice.
Once he's checked in to his usual penthouse suite, Churchill can indulge in one of his lifelong passions, gambling.
Gambling and visiting the casinos gave him very genuine enjoyment, even when he lost.
Churchill having this love of luxury and gambling, this is a side of Churchill which we perhaps gloss over, but it's a very important part of his character.
Churchill needed an adrenaline rush in his life. He likes taking risks. That's one of the things that you can argue makes him such an effective war leader. But in peacetime, it means that he needs to fulfill that need in other ways, and gambling is something that gives him that.
Churchill's wife Clementine doesn't like him gambling.
He would lose money and he would promise never to do it again, and then he would do it again.
So Churchill tries to indulge in his favourite pastime discreetly.
He could go down through a door in the lobby and down into a secret passage which led him under the square and up into the casino, so no one knew where he'd gone.
But his celebrity follows Churchill wherever he goes.
When Churchill goes to the casinos, he is greeted with applause, and people treat him as a hero.
On one occasion, Frank Sinatra came up and shook his hand and said, "I've always wanted to do that." And my grandfather turned to his private secretary and said, "Who the hell is that?"
Having had enough of his fans, Churchill takes a break with his new best friend, millionaire Greek shipping magnate Aristotle Onassis.
For Onassis, Churchill is something of a trophy. He does tend to collect famous individuals. Churchill, he is the most recognisable man on the planet, and so he's looking for retreats. And of course, Aristotle Onassis can give Churchill the sort of luxury escape that he needs.
The two men set sail, cruising the Mediterranean on the Christina, the mega yacht of Aristotle Onassis.
My grandfather loved travelling on the Christina. He said, "I'm a man of simple tastes, easily satisfied by the best." It was an extraordinarily luxurious, wonderful boat.
This is a photograph of the 88-year-old Churchill and Onassis when they came ashore on their cruise.
Churchill certainly is entering into the spirit of Monte Carlo. He looks dapper. Churchill here certainly doesn't look like a Whitehall warrior. He is looking much more like a playboy. If he wasn't giving that famous V sign, it could be any elderly gentleman in the south of France.
Churchill's wife Clementine isn't happy with his antics in the south of France. She's worried about how they might affect his legacy.
Clementine never liked the south of France. She thought it was a sunny place for shady people. She didn't really like the way that everyone sort of fawned over Churchill. She wanted him to enjoy himself, to have great holidays, but this was actually rather vulgar.
It's not consistent with the popular view of Churchill as being the man who won the war. Here is somebody who is completely comfortable and totally self-indulgent.
Churchill doesn't care if his lifestyle is threatening to tarnish his reputation. He thinks he's already set his image for generations to come in print.
Churchill was a prolific writer and historian throughout his career, and it was by writing history that he sought to control his legacy.
This is the man who had stood up in the House of Commons in the late 1940s and said that he thought it was best for all parties to leave the past to history, especially as he was going to write that history himself.
In 1953, Churchill published the 6th and final volume of his history of the Second World War.
It's no surprise that Churchill's history of the Second World War places him at the heart of events, and in particular Dunkirk, the moment where the island nation stood alone against Nazi tyranny and was roused by his rhetoric. So by writing a history, he was able to weave the way that the memory of the Second World War was constructed in Britain.
Churchill's confident that if he dies tomorrow, his legacy is sealed. So he goes on living his playboy lifestyle. But what he does next threatens to destroy everything. Winston Churchill is on his way to the Houses of Parliament. He's just got back from his latest jaunt to the French Riviera. But despite being 88 years old, he's still a serving MP.
It's hard to think how one could possibly have a longer political career. He first stood in a by-election in 1899. He achieved the unique feat of switching parties twice. He lost seats and had to change constituencies a number of times. But in spite of that, ended up as the father of the House of Commons, the longest-serving MP.
Today is a rare visit. Churchill doesn't attend the House of Commons very often anymore. To preserve Churchill's legacy as Britain's great war leader, many would prefer he stopped attending the House of Commons altogether.
One of the big debates for Churchill's inner circle and for the party is how do you persuade someone like Winston Churchill to stand down and finally retire? There was talk about the possibility of him becoming a duke, but he is not at all interested in going to the Lords. He enjoyed being plain Mr. Winston Churchill. And of course, as Mr. Winston Churchill, he knew that he was already on a plane of celebrity that was far above any member of the House of Lords.
On arrival, Churchill heads to the bar.
Going to the House of Commons, that was what he liked doing, but he couldn't go to the House of Commons unless he remained a member of Parliament. And I can quite understand why he wanted to go there. It's like a club.
Turning up to the House of Commons only to prop up the bar is damaging Churchill's political reputation. And it's costing him votes. At the last general election, the Conservatives won by a landslide. But Churchill's majority went down.
For a new generation of voters born in the 1940s, people who hadn't lived through the Second World War and hadn't seen Churchill's performance during the Second World War, Churchill was the last of the Victorians, this bumbling figure in Victorian clothes, walking with a stick. He had very little relevance to the bright new world of the swinging 60s.
In this modern world, even Churchill's own party consider him out of date.
Of course, there's lots of respect for him and admiration for his achievement, but the Conservative Party, to survive and win elections, can't just rely on older voters. It has to appeal to this new electorate as well. And wheeling out Winston Churchill isn't going to help them do that.
Churchill is out of step with mainstream opinion on one of the biggest issues of the day: the end of the British Empire. Kenya is about to gain its independence. For Churchill, the great imperialist, this is a change he just can't get his head around.
Churchill was a lifelong believer in Britain and her empire. Churchill was desperate to hold on to that vision of Britain as a great power.
He did not want decolonisation to jeopardise white supremacy. There's a temptation to fall back on the tired narrative that these historical figures are products of their time, as if to imply that their racism was more acceptable back then. But British attitudes towards colonisation were starting to turn. Churchill was, in this sense, out of touch with the British public.
Unable to stop the end of his beloved empire, Churchill becomes increasingly downbeat about his political legacy.
He'd said in 1942 that he had not become the King's First Minister in order to preside over the liquidation of the British Empire. Nonetheless, the empire which he wanted to preserve is clearly on its way out. He says on at least one occasion, "I have achieved everything only to achieve nothing."
Eventually, Churchill's wife Clementine persuades the 89-year-old he must retire. This photo was taken of him as he made his way to the House of Commons for the final time.
It's a really interesting image. He is considerably more frail. I love the fact that he's still got his navy polka dot bow tie on though. That's something he's worn throughout his career. It's almost like his sort of political uniform.
Churchill has served longer than any other MP in the 20th century, yet there's no fanfare during his final visit.
Proceedings went on as usual. Nobody noticed when Churchill entered the chamber. He sat down in his usual seat and listened a bit to the debate, and then he left the chamber. Churchill walked past the Speaker's chair on his way out of the chamber. He turned very awkwardly, because he was very stiff, and bowed to the Speaker and walked on. And that was his final goodbye to the House of Commons.
Out of politics for the first time in 65 years, Churchill retreats to Kent and his much-loved country home, Chartwell.
What you see is a gradual withdrawing into himself. He's clearly no longer capable of the sustained repartee and conversation that he'd been famous for in the past. The things that he takes pleasure from become simpler and simpler, to the extent where he enjoys sitting and watching the butterflies in the garden at Chartwell.
It's already been decided that this home of the great man is so important it should be preserved. When Churchill dies, it will be given to the National Trust and open to the public.
Of course, all of our homes change in terms of decor and use of spaces over time, so they have to pick a particular point to represent.
Churchill's wife Clementine spots an opportunity. She starts thinking about how Chartwell could help to shape his legacy.
Clementine orders it to be restored to how it had been in its heyday, so it's no longer reconfigured as it was to accommodate an elderly man.
The grab rails will have to go. Clementine doesn't want people to remember her husband as a doddering old man.
I think it's particularly interesting to think about Lady Churchill curating her husband's legacy. It's Lady Churchill's wish that Chartwell will reflect the golden age of Chartwell, which in her mind was the late 20s and 1930s. in those years in the lead up to the Second World War.
Clementine sees herself as one of the key guardians for Churchill's legacy. And she certainly wasn't afraid to play an active role in shaping that legacy and also removing parts of it that she didn't feel were appropriate.
10 years ago, she took against a portrait given to Churchill by the House of Commons on his 80th birthday. She had it burned.
The portrait is a remarkable example of modern art.
My grandmother wasn't going to let it see the light of day. She thought it was very unflattering. She would like him to look as he looked in his finest hour, not as he looked as a very old 80-year-old with his fly buttons looking as though they were about to come undone. It was a very unattractive picture.
Churchill's 90th birthday is approaching fast. He and Clementine leave Chartwell and make their way to their London home to celebrate.
When he left Chartwell in the autumn of 1964, he didn't know that he wouldn't come back again to the home that he loved.
But as this extraordinary life comes to a close, Churchill's fighting spirit will go on to the very end. It's Winston Churchill's 90th birthday. He's celebrating with his family at his London home.
We were all round the table, and it wasn't a very jolly affair. He was sitting there, and he wasn't really part of the situation. He wasn't aware of what was going on. He was very, very, very old.
Those who were around Churchill in those final years were incredibly protective and discreet. Churchill's mental health is something that was not discussed at the time, but it is clear that it was declining. It would be surprising, given his age, if there hadn't been signs of dementia.
Now Churchill's finally retired, Clementine hopes her husband can have a quiet and dignified end.
At Sir Winston's house in Hyde Park Gate, crowds of well-wishers braved the wintry weather during the birthday celebration of the greatest living Englishman.
Among the throng are dozens of television cameras and reporters. Churchill goes to the window to greet the crowds.
He's wearing one of his velvet one-piece siren suits that he wore during the Second World War. He's clearly very frail, but you can see that even now he still wants to play this role.
There are huge numbers of crowds there, plenty of umbrellas showing they're withstanding the elements in order to be there, and Lady Churchill there on hand to help her husband.
And then she very purposefully closes the window. She's prepared to allow the crowd a glimpse of him, but no more.
For Lady Churchill, Winston came first, second and third. She poured so much of her time and energy into not only supporting her husband, but advising and being an absolute rock for him throughout their entire marriage. She wants to make sure that his legacy is secured and is keen to do whatever she can to support the continuation of his legacy.
Less than a month after his 90th birthday, Churchill has a major stroke and needs round-the-clock care. But there's still plenty of life in him.
Patience was a virtue with which he was totally unacquainted.
There are lots of stories about Churchill's refusal to conform with doctor's orders. There's no doubt that he was stubborn and that if he wanted to do something, then he would make it happen.
He would still smoke cigars in bed and occasionally set light to the sheets. He wasn't an easy patient.
Behind the scenes, top secret plans for what should happen when Churchill finally dies swing into action. These plans, codenamed Operation Hope Not, were first drawn up over 10 years ago and come from the very top.
Queen Elizabeth II decides that Winston Churchill will have a state funeral. It is at the monarch's discretion. It's an incredibly rare event in history. Only a handful of individuals have ever been given state funerals. The Queen has known Winston Churchill all of her life. They met first when she was just 2 years old. Having witnessed his role as Prime Minister in the Second World War, Queen Elizabeth II made arrangements that Winston Churchill should be given a funeral, to use her words, on a scale befitting his position in history. And so from that point onwards, the scale of proceedings grew and grew as time went on. There was a growing sense that he should, at the end of his life, have an occasion which could be witnessed by as many people as possible.
It's very clear that this is going to be an enormous public occasion.
When the story gets out that Churchill is seriously ill, his London home is surrounded by people.
I arrived at the flat in Hyde Park Gate and it was crowds of journalists and people, and it was just jam-packed.
It becomes a media circus, with Churchill's doctor, Lord Moran, giving updates on his health from the doorstep.
And there has been a cerebral thrombosis.
Each day, the crowds grow larger. Eventually, Clementine asks people to move away from the house. From a distance, the vigil continues as Churchill's health dominates the news.
The headline of that newspaper is very significant. This is the story of Winston battling death.
The story gets told as another example of this great hero struggling in adversity. He kept fighting until the very end.
Not everyone is speaking in hushed tones around the dying Churchill.
Churchill's a symbol of the old order. He becomes a target for the satirists. Private Eye is founded in 1963, and they start referring to Churchill as the greatest dying Englishman.
The legacy Churchill and Clementine have worked so hard to shape is under threat. After several days, Churchill is showing no signs of recovery. His son-in-law, Christopher Soames, arrives to sit at Churchill's bedside. He turns to Soames and says, "I am so bored of it all," and then slips into a coma.
Churchill's last words, "I'm so bored with it all," it's very surprising, really. Given Churchill's concern with his reputation, you might have expected that Churchill would come up with some witty one-liner, but there was nothing like that. These words, "I'm so bored with it all," are such a human emotion, isn't it?
Ten days later, on the 24th of January 1965, Churchill's family are gathered around his bedside.
He had his marmalade cat curled up by his side. It was quite clear what was happening. And he was breathing and breathing. And then suddenly he took 3 long breaths. And that was it. And the silence.
Exactly 70 years earlier, to the day, his father, Lord Randolph Churchill, passed away. But you've not just got that coincidence. There is this incredible fact that for the last 10 years of his life, he has been telling people that he is convinced he is going to pass away on the same day that his father did.
Churchill was holding out to die on the same day of his father. A man who had such an influence and impact on his life. Churchill was arguably always trying to prove himself to the memory of his father. And I think what you're seeing here may be the last example of that Churchillian spirit and will in holding out to die on that day.
Churchill has died, but his story isn't over. When his long-awaited funeral finally gets underway, many hope this historic send-off will unite the nation as never before. It's 3 days since Winston Churchill died. In central London, they're holding a full-scale rehearsal for his state funeral. An event it's hoped will define his legacy as the greatest Englishman for generations to come.
The solemnity of the procession is very, very carefully choreographed. Nothing was being left to chance.
Years of planning have gone into Churchill's funeral, but some are concerned that all this pageantry could strike the wrong note in 1960s Britain.
You've got to think that at this point you're in the height of the swinging 60s. You are in one of the most exciting cities in the world.
We have the satire boom, we have the Beatles. But Churchill's funeral points to an older, traditional model of British greatness.
In the East End, there's already a problem. After the funeral service, Churchill's coffin is to be carried down the Thames, and it's been decided that the cranes of the Docklands should lower their jibs out of respect for the great man. But the dock workers are refusing to do it.
We shouldn't assume that everyone admired Churchill as a great man. Because we're usually so preoccupied with the Second World War when we talk about Churchill, we can forget what an incredibly contentious figure he was.
Eventually, the dockers agree to take part in the funeral for a price. 3 days before Churchill's funeral, the doors of Westminster Hall open for the public to pay their respects as Churchill lies in state.
When Winston Churchill dies, he has been the longest serving politician of the 20th century. And so it is fitting that the lying in state take place in Westminster.
The scene has been carefully composed.
The way that it has been laid out is that your eye is drawn completely to the coffin in the middle, draped in the Union flag, beautifully lit by these candles around the edge. You would have been struck by a sense that you yourself were witnessing history.
The public response is overwhelming. Over the course of 3 days, 300,000 people queue in freezing conditions to pay their respects. Among them is Churchill's former secretary, Lady Williams.
I remember taking my son to walk past, so it gets me very upset. I found it too overwhelming. You know, we all who worked for him, we loved him deeply.
Even those who have never met Churchill are moved.
People felt that they knew him personally. Many of them would have heard Churchill's voice over the airwaves during World War II. Many of them had been in the armed forces, or they'd been civilians who might have been subjected to bombing raids. This is a kind of elegy for the profound experience of World War II, some of the memories of which may have become rose-tinted with time.
The day of Churchill's funeral arrives. At 9:45, Big Ben tolls. The coffin of the man who led Britain to victory in the Second World War begins its procession.
Not since the last century has the honor of a state funeral been accorded to a commoner, but who more worthy of it than this man who provided us with an image of ourselves as we would wish to be?
For those who were lining the streets of London on the day of Winston Churchill's state funeral, it would have felt almost like they'd been transported back in time. You're in the height of the swinging 60s, and yet for one grey day in January, London is taken over by this pageantry that seems of an age long gone.
Over 500,000 people are lining the streets to watch Churchill's funeral procession.
The crowd was silent, and my sister and I were in the same carriage. But it was an extraordinary journey. The crowds were so close, you could see the tears in their eyes. And it was terribly moving.
Along with the mourners, there are 36 cameras along the route, broadcasting the event live to a global audience of 350 million people. Britain may have lost its empire, but it can still put on a show.
Churchill's funeral is a spectacular, epic event. Very, very carefully designed to be covered by the media and in particular by television.
Every single thing along the way is designed to celebrate his role as a wartime hero. You've got the 19-gun salute. You've got the fly past. You've got thousands of soldiers lining the route. Cavalry officers in their plumed helmets and their red capes. You've got the guards regiments in their bearskins. You've got sailors in blue who are pulling the gun carriages.
Churchill's funeral allows Britons watching on the streets and at home to feel great again because he connects them with the country's finest hour.
With Britain's empire at an end, Britain returned to its glory days, and its glory days was its victory in the Second World War, and Churchill personified that victory.
The funeral procession arrives at St. Paul's Cathedral for Churchill's memorial service.
St. Paul's Cathedral is a really interesting choice. It's arguably more intuitive, given his role as politician, to have had it at Westminster Abbey, but we know that symbolism played its part in the decision.
During the Blitz, St. Paul's miraculous survival became a symbol of British endurance.
So it is perhaps fitting then that this building associated with British wartime resilience should host the funeral of the figurehead of the nation's spirit of resilience at that time.
We are assembled here on the occasion of the burial of a great man.
During the service, despite her grief, Churchill's widow Clementine is the model of composure.
She summons every ounce of her own strength that she will not show her own emotions that day. She's incredibly dignified. That's how she wanted it all to be.
After the service, Churchill's coffin is taken by barge down the Thames to Waterloo station. Having been paid off, it's time for the dock workers to play their part.
As the barge with his coffin in it went down the Thames, the cranes were made to bow in reverence, and it was very moving.
With that final flourish, this extraordinary event designed to seal Churchill's place in history is over.
At the end of her husband's funeral, Clementine turns to her daughter Mary and says, "It wasn't a funeral, it was a triumph."
Churchill is now the embodiment of Britain's victory in the Second World War, and it is this that will be his legacy.
That image of Churchill leading his country to victory in the Second World War is so powerful that it eclipses much that he did before the war and much that he did afterwards. And it makes it hard to pull his whole career, good and bad, into perspective.
At 3:30, Churchill's coffin arrives at a small churchyard in Blaydon, Oxfordshire, for a private burial.
Churchill is buried within sight of his birthplace at Blenheim Palace. Also the place where he proposed to Clementine.
Here, according to his wishes, Churchill is interred alongside his father.
One of the things that had driven Churchill all the way through his life was to prove himself to the memory of his father and to prove himself worthy of his lineage.
It was a very simple service. There were a few prayers and the coffin was lowered into the grave.
As the coffin was lowered, Clementine muttered these words, "I will be with you again." And it was a very private and a very tender moment.
Away from the crowds and the cameras, Churchill the man, not the legend, is put to rest.